So thank you very much. And I'm welcoming you to this session on the service sector competitiveness challenges. And as I said before, we have an extra presenter. So I'm just asking all of you to stick to the 10 minutes, okay? And I'm not a very good timekeeper, so I'm just relying on you that you are going to stick on the 10 minutes. So we start with Dr. Markinson from the PBL, it's a long name, Dutch Environmental Assessment Agency. Mark is one of the researchers from our team that has put together the interregional trade data, and today he is going to present some of our analysis on the competitiveness. The floor is yours.
Okay. Well, I'll try to stick to my 10 minutes and speed up and try to be as fast as possible. Basically, we take off where Phil kind of left, in the sense of we do a comparative analysis and we focus on economic competitiveness of sectors and regions. And yeah, the team is mainly consisting of the people from Rotterdam next to me, but also the rest of the team is involved with Raquel and Phil and Bart. We're discussing a lot. Yeah, basically, what did we do? Well, we have kind of the same picture as before, but now we do not build up a wall. We have real tariff barriers in here, and also non-tariff barriers, which are subject to some kind of scenario. And we took one of the available scenarios, one of the LSE, which we followed. And for the rest, the analysis is a bit comparable to what Phil presented, in that what is important is complete value chain, which is behind it. And this time it's more like a cost chain. So it's how costs are affected in producing something. So like British steel being exported to some German region, which is subsequently made into cans and going back as beer. And in the end of the process, there's 2 times a tariff, because 2 times you pass this border, and the more times you pass this border in the whole production process, the more barriers you will be faced and the higher the cost will be. And then you also see that a tariff in a completely different industry can influence the production cost of this other industry in this sector. And that's actually the main focus of what we are looking at. So how much is production cost rising in different sectors in different regions in the UK, but also in the rest of Europe. And this is the end effect of what I present is additional to any tariff, because this is the effect that your production costs are rising. And still, if you sell this product abroad, you will still get a tariff. So this is all additional cost to the tariff costs. So immediately jumping to the results, and what you see here is if you do this very carefully and we look at 72 products, we have services and products, and we look at the detail of 72 product services where tariffs can be levied or where non-tariff barriers can occur, and then you immediately see that we get a slightly different picture than before, but there's large variation for the UK of where the impact will be. So the more red means the higher cost, and this is the average. I cannot show you all the different sectors because it's simply too much to show. And you see again that London will be relatively little hit, but that especially the north and also especially the east will be hit quite severely in terms of production costs. But okay, this is production cost increase. It doesn't tell you so much yet about competitiveness, because if everybody's costs increase, then nothing really happens. But you see here already that the variation is large, which came already first, in the previous session was also discussed about. So this is definitely something you can also not fix with an exchange rate change, because that will be one price change, and you will have regional problems in the UK, no matter what. So what are the reasons for this regional variation? That's not only the production structure itself, but it's also the trade relationships of these sectors in these regions and how these regions are affected. So this is where we take this complete value chain into account, but just we only look at the prices you pay for the goods you're using. Now this gives me a bit of the picture about how high are these increases in the production cost. And you might think this is not so big. Well, I think they are very big because these are averages for the industry. And this implies that there will be some firms that will be easily 3-4 times these numbers, and there will be firms which have far less, of course. But I think this describes you pretty hard hits. And of course, for London, yeah, a lot of these sectors I show here are not the biggest sectors of London, but still, food is quite substantial here, whether you know it or not. But food is substantial, seems in my data at least, a substantial sector in London, and there you have 2.5 to 3% just pure cost increases, and in the services we already had the supportive services, which also show up here as being hit indirectly with cost increases for 1% on average. For financial services is a bit less, but all these is also very much dependent on things we do not know. And what am I referring to is especially non-tariff barriers, which I think is a bit, people often immediately jump to the scenarios and say we do not know much, but there's a bit more that we really do not know, and that is these non-tariff barriers, which is limited research in this, and I will come back to it completely at the end of my presentation as showing you something which often I think is not taken into account. So I came back to if everybody's costs increase, then it doesn't tell you much about competition or competitiveness. And we need some concept of competition. And what do we use as a concept of competition is something we call revealed competition, so something we can see. And that means we divide up the world, and especially the regions in Europe, as being different markets, and we look at who is competing with whom where. So let's suppose Rotterdam is exporting its products. Well, the pattern looks a bit like this, like two half circles where most of the products go to, which are exported from Rotterdam. If you look at Paris exports, they look like a kind of circle around France, half a circle around France. But if you look at like a place like Vienna, then this is kind of a complete circle around the country, like a donut looking. And if you look like who is competing now more with the other, then that will be who has the most overlap in its markets. Well, the most overlap in its markets have Rotterdam and Paris, because they export their products to the same market. So there they are competing with each other. And those we are comparing. And this exactly is the same thing I will do with these cost increases. So all over Europe we have cost increases due to a Brexit. But is there a relative cost increase to your competitors? Because then it has really an effect for the firms, because suddenly they become more expensive than their competitor. So how does this picture look like? And this, I hope it's clear, big enough on the screen behind me, but this gives some very interesting results. Here I look at complete competition, and if you know a little bit more about competition, most firms compete with firms in their neighborhood. So what's the interesting part is what's coming out here is if I look at these cost changes that regions are like Manchester, the greater regions is actually profiting from the Brexit. I think nobody told you that before. And the reason is that actually, and it's a very sad reason of course, is that the neighboring regions are even hit more than Manchester itself. So in the competition, they have a less cost increase than their neighbors. So I admit this is a very sad story, but you can give it a very positive twist towards Manchester. But this is the way we look. In general, of course, if you look, yeah, the picture for the UK is not very nice because, yeah, the cost increases are much higher in the UK than outside of the UK. However, you see also, if you look only at international competition, then the advantage of Manchester disappears. Because then you only compare with international competitors, and there the cost increases are much lower than the cost increase for Manchester itself. Now, we did also a lot of research on what kind of policies you can do. I do this very fast. And basically, first we looked at comparing how the development is of the regions in the UK and compare it to the development of their competitors. And if we look at this picture, it's very sad a bit for the UK, but it reflects what we mentioned before, is that the only good points, these are the green dots, they are looking good. The red dots are not the good dots. Most regions had actually very poor performance and growth in the UK. I go very fast. And in this diagram, we see that to the left-hand side, it's not good, and to the right-hand side, it's good in the diagram. So if you're moving to the right, it's better. So we see the financial services in London improve. They recovered from the crisis. They moved to the right-hand side in the left-hand corner. But overall, London seems to be the only sector which is really performing good. Now, if you compare it to your competitors, so suppose we have seen now the financial services are hit. What could we do? What could we learn from competitors from financial services in London to make some policy around this, make some policies to improve it, to correct for the Brexit? So you think, okay, Brexit will hit the financial services, the costs are going up. Can we develop some policies that will help the financial sector? In this case, we look at all the competitors and what were these competitors good in. And on this website, which will be available, you can see these large leaves. And these large leaves say this is an important factor. This is something that your competitors did better over the years, those who are winning from you. And what we found is, for instance, housing. Not so surprising for London. Affordable housing seems to be very important. I think most people can imagine something with this. It seems to be expensive here. So apparently international competitors are cheaper for the affordable housing. But if we look at trade, this is very interesting, at least for me, is one of the factors what these regions are good in, regions that did better in the financial services, is actually internationalization. So getting more open. And this is actually the opposite of what's going to happen with Brexit. So these are things we didn't take into account yet, but these competitiveness issues tell us also that if we want to learn from the competitors, what this seems to show is actually that Brexit even makes it worse. Because it would be one of my policy advices, focus more on internationalization. And that's, not going to happen. So, these are a lot of the outcomes of our new research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. So now Professor Simon Markinson, he's a professor of international higher education at the UCL, and he's going to present the Brexit challenges for higher education institutions in the UK.
Thank you, Raquel. Thank you also, Dan and Jonathan. Good program and a good chance to see our part of the Brexit industry at work. You can see that our preoccupation and our research is with higher education and research and what happens there. 160 plus higher education institutions in the UK, distributed across all 4 nations and across the country, but tending to concentrate in the larger cities. We've been working on system-wide data, looking at the effects which are partly differentiated across the sector of European exposure in relation to EU students, EU staff, and the research schemes, and looking at patterns of Europeanisation in research in relation to type of institution and also discipline, where some disciplines are much more dependent on European research programs than others. We will move next, I think, to look at the distribution of structural funds, European structural funds across the university and higher education institution sector and see how that's playing out differently from region to region. Our case studies are in Aberdeen and St Andrews in Scotland, South Wales in Wales, the University of Ulster in Northern Ireland, and then a group of Midlands and North institutions, Manchester, Keele, Sheffield, Hallam, Durham. We're going to interview next in Coventry, and Exeter is also on the list, and we're at SOAS in London. No one else in London, and that's been a problem. We haven't been to King's College to ask them because we've done so much research at King's College in the last 18 months already, but we've had a knockback at Oxford and Cambridge and Queen's and Queen Mary, and I think we'll probably, and Imperial, people are very nervous about talking about Brexit on the record. I think they will probably do UCL, so we will have a large European exposed research university in the data set. So universities are located, as I said, in cities, and there are also important regional differences in the pattern of activity. The implications, though, in the first instance that we've been looking at have been the financial ones, and it's clear that the university sector faces major issues of financial sustainability in the medium term. Because you look at those revenue items that are affected by Brexit, and they're big items. Horizon 2020 and the other research schemes, UK puts in about $5.5 billion and takes out about $8.5 billion in terms of research activity. So it's extremely competitive within the European research sector, and but this has been a major source of our talent, those network relationships through the research projects, and of course major sustaining factor in terms of the position of UK universities worldwide. Their sort of much discussed second position after the United States is really dependent on European links. And second only to that in importance, European structural funds, especially in the poorer parts of the country, especially in Wales and the north. And it's hard to imagine how the pattern of infrastructure development would have taken place without those structural funds. And this has been a major item in linking the universities to their regions, to their communities, has been the resources available through European structural funds. So that's a big chunk of income in some institutions, a major item. European Union, non-UK European Union citizen student fees also important in two different kinds of places. They're important in London, where especially at master's level, LSE, for example, will shut down a lot of its master's programs after Brexit, unless there's some change that we can't foresee in the landscape. But there's a surprising presence of European students in a lot of middle-level players and regional players in the UK who've decided to focus on European student entry as a way of building total enrolments and also sustaining an international mission. So Aberdeen, for example, has a very high proportion of its students are European, non-UK European citizens, and it's around about 30%. So this is hard. Again, this will be a major effect. I mean, when presumably European students after Brexit will pay full international student fees, there may be a special deal struck, although I think it's unlikely. But it's likely they'll be paying full international student fees up front rather than using an income contingent loan system, and that will of course drive down enrolments in the middle level institutions quite dramatically. It may mean that in net revenue terms some institutions taking in much more in fees per student, although having less students, may come out on top, but most of them will lose income in that area and of course lose the educational benefits of that cohort. So these are big items, and but equally important perhaps is the talent flows, which don't appear as financial items, but they are very much about not only about raw research power, because a lot of the best PhD students in the STEM disciplines in the universities we're interviewing in are coming from Western Europe. They're coming from Germany particularly. Not only raw talent in that sense, but also the sensibilities that European students bring to bear on the student population as a whole. That sense of identity and belonging in Europe, of course, which is so strong amongst many young people, is partly sustained by the presence of non-UK citizen, EU citizen students. Talent flows are important, finance is important. In the absence of the link to the European Union, the international, non-EU international student category becomes very important. And it becomes very important it is already important, it becomes more important. And it becomes more important in raw financial terms because international student fees are the balancing item. When you lose revenue on home students, you lose revenue on research, you lose revenue on structural funds. The only way you plug the hole, the only way that exists at scale, I mean, very few universities make much money out of patents or links to industry, to be realistic, and only Oxford and Cambridge do really well in those areas. For most universities, it's pumping up international student fees. And that's been very difficult to do in the last 5 years. Total numbers have not changed because they've been deliberately held down by the Home Office in a very successful set of intermeshed policies like the rate and cost of visas, the level of enrolment that the Home Office permits. If you want to increase your international student enrolment, you have to make a case to the Home Office. And you have to get the Home Office to agree to your extra 200 or extra 400. And the Home Office always says, why? Why should we increase your quota? And it says no in some cases. So this is not a demand-driven market. This is not really a market at all. This is an administered quota system, and that's commercial international education. So very difficult to increase international student numbers under the present migration policies. But I mean, I'm optimistic. I'm pessimistic about the European research schemes. I think we're going to lose substantially there. I'm optimistic that we will see a break in the migration policy impasse. We will see an opening up of international student enrolments. We will see growth in that sector, although it hasn't happened yet. The Migration Advisory Committee in October is the point at which it could begin to happen if it happens. But the PM's been very tough on immigration and very tough on international students up to now, and as yet hasn't publicly changed their mind, so it hasn't happened yet. So they're the scenarios on financial sustainability, what you might call the best case, the middle case and the worst case, and the middle case looks most likely to me in most areas. But you can see that if you if you think of an individual institution, if you know its balance sheet even broadly, and you start to put numbers in those cells, there's a very substantial net losses there for most institutions. But it varies. I mean, and it's a bit like the London versus the region scenario. I mean, overall with Brexit. I mean, with the universities, the London-based institutions are very heavily engaged in the talent flows and very dependent on the research-based links. In some of the regional areas, it's more about structural funds, and in some cases, EU students, although EU students are scattered around in different kinds of institution in different parts of the country. I suppose if it's anything, it's the big Russell Group players, especially in London, but also in Oxford and Cambridge, are very dependent on the research schemes, and the regional players, the lesser status institutions, are dependent on structural funds to a marked degree, and it's the structural funds that look the least likely to survive, even in terms of domestic replacement. Mm-hmm. So what we've found in our research is, very briefly, is a surprising lack of activity in response to Brexit, a marked difference between institutions in their level of capacity, the kind of resources they're putting into scenario planning, data gathering, strategy making, building new links in Europe on a bilateral basis. Our big Russell Group player that we saw first is doing those things to a marked degree in a way the others weren't when we saw them. I think there's more going on than we could see, but not much more. There's a number of people have said in different places to us, this is a matter for the next Vice-Chancellor. This won't hit the institution in my time or the time of the current Vice-Chancellor. And that is playing into a certain willingness to procrastinate, to delay. I think there's also a larger problem at work. This is a very centralised polity. People have a strong sense of their own autonomy and freedom, but at the same time, issues and policies are shaped very much in Westminster. And notwithstanding the devolved character of the four nations, Westminster sets the agenda. In an area like this sector, which is so centralised in policy and regulatory terms, it's always been government setting the agenda, and then the autonomous sector reserving the right to disagree, and sometimes doing so in the rhetoric anyway. But basically government has set the rules. Now, in the university sector, for the most part still, people are waiting for the government to say what the policy is and what the choices are. And of course the government doesn't have any idea what the choices are in relation to higher education and research yet. It's a third level problem, and the government doesn't know what the big picture looks like yet. So in this area, the government's unable to set the agenda. The higher education sector is waiting for it to set the agenda, and it's not happening. So, Raquel, I'll just say one more thing. The issue that's really come through to us in our casework has been the importance of the regional factor. And we've detected an increasing number of middle-level universities at regional level saying we need to orientate better to our communities. Brexit voters told us this. We need to build better relationships with the Brexit voting hinterland that's around the university town that voted Remain. And that seems to me quite a positive development, but there's a tension there between the local networking and local orientation of universities and their global and European links, and especially their orientation to international students and building income through that device. And I think finding a bridge between the international and global and European role on one hand and the local region building, local town building, but rural hinterland as well on the other, that's the task.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. Very interesting. I think it's very, very relevant what he was explaining today for many of the people who are sitting here today. So the next presentation is given by John-Jin Teo. Yeah, well, I want that everybody please clap for Simon because he has to go, and I think we have to appreciate that he was here today. John-Jin Teo is a secondee for Pricewaterhouse who joined the CBI, and he has contributed to the CBI policy positions on regulation post-Brexit for financial services and professional services. And also he has contributed to the work on the importance of securing UK-EU trade in services post-Brexit. So please, John-Jin.
Well, thank you, Raquel, and thank you very much for having me here today. It's a real pleasure. I thought what I would do is to use this session to just give the broad business view of what the key challenges are, particularly for services firms post-Brexit. But hopefully it has already been made abundantly clear to everyone in this room about the importance of services trade to the UK economy, not only in its own right, but certainly in terms of the deep interlinkages it shares with other goods sectors, as well as in company supply chains. Just to contextualize the discussion as well, I thought I would just give a bit of a background as to how services trade works, and I'm sure many of you are also familiar with this. Now, frankly, services trade is complicated, and even in the days when the foundations of the single market were being shaped, it was always very challenging to get agreement around the table on services, and part of this is to do with the multifaceted ways in which services are traded. There are different ways and modes. It can be traded remotely. It could mean a UK-based consultant giving advice to a client based in Sweden, or supplied in close proximity to the customer, such as an Italian architecture firm opening a branch in London, or in terms of an Italian student who's studying in a university in the UK, or in fact, even a UK lawyer advising a French client on UK or EU law in Paris. And I think what also makes it particularly complex is the patchwork of rules that operate behind the border that not only cut across different sectors, so things like labor laws, the right to establish offices overseas, government procurement and data transfers, but also very sector-specific rules and requirements, things around professional qualifications, the mobility of professionals, and particularly in financial services, domestic rules around licensing, capital, and liquidity requirements. So I think understanding the importance of these different modes of service provision and how regulations play into that is crucial to understanding which parts of the system are actually, incredibly important in underpinning UK-EU services trade. I would want to highlight, the 5 top challenges that we hear from our services members in terms of Brexit. I think the first is the risk of cliff edge. With the withdrawal agreement, there is some degree of certainty for issues like goods that are already on the market, but the same cannot be said of services. So if I were to take an example, contracts is a very good example of this. There is no legal certainty about the position of legacy contracts that have already been agreed pre-Brexit. Which affects millions of insurance and pensions contracts and contractual arrangements. Insurers, for example, they are stuck in a real quandary as to whether it would be legally possible to pay out claims to EU nationals post-Brexit. And that's a real concern because if you are in a situation where they can no longer do this, then clearly they have to make a choice between either breaking the law or breaking their promise to customers. So clearly that needs to be addressed urgently. I think the second issue as well that's related to the idea of cliff edge is data. Now data is absolutely crucial. It is integral to international trade as well as trade with the EU. In fact, 3/4 of the UK's cross-border flows in data are with other EU countries. And that supports a UK data economy that is worth £240 billion in the UK. It's central to e-commerce, it's central to payments, research and innovation, for law enforcement and security cooperation. And certainly in terms of the business challenge as well, for many multinational companies, they also often benefit from being able to manage their employees, their HR information, all from a single location. Many insurance companies as well, many of them process the claims made by EU nationals in the UK, which obviously involves the transfer of personal data across borders as well. So again, another key area where continuity needs to be preserved. And I think the third issue is around continued access to talent and labor mobility on both sides of the channel. Now, for services firms, human capital is absolutely central to their business. What are they selling? They're selling human capital. They are selling talent, essentially. And more than half of our members, and this was based on a survey on employment trends that we did with them late in December last year. And more than half of them were really worried about being able to access highly skilled migrants, but also in terms of filling skills and labor shortages elsewhere. So certainly not just in the highly skilled space, but also across the skills spectrum. And many services businesses like consulting firms, architecture, legal services, many of these services are offered on a fly-in, fly-out basis. So workers can often travel to European countries on very short notice to meet clients, to represent them in court, and many other projects. Companies also frequently engage or allow employees to engage in international secondments. And one of our members as well, which is a large global professional services firm, said that its UK employees undertook 17,000 business trips into the EU, and in the other direction, 10,000 trips were made from the EU into the UK. So I think that really highlights the importance of continued labour mobility across borders between the UK and the EU. And I think alongside this as well, I think there also needs to be emphasis on issues like the mutual recognition of professional qualifications that enable high-skilled workers to carry out, very high value-adding services to EU clients and vice versa in the UK. And the UK has also benefited significantly from EU frameworks that grant recognition of qualifications obtained in the UK, and so have the many EU nationals who have undertaken UK professional qualifications as well. The fourth challenge is to negotiate a new international precedent in the trade and services and digital products. I think the new trading relationship has to reflect the deep degree of integration in services trade between the UK and the EU. Central to this question is what do we do around issues like regulatory alignment? And I think it has to be said that not all services trade will need to rely on continued alignment of rules to remain competitive. You know, there are a number of services that can be provided on an unregulated basis. So things like, you know, management and strategy consulting services, much of that will still continue. But it is very clear that for many other sectors, the alignment of rules across countries, combined with the principle of mutual recognition, has enabled individuals and businesses to provide services in other countries in a fairly, you know, frictionless way. And this is very much the case in areas like audiovisual and broadcasting, and creative services, and aviation, and financial services, and many others. And I think finally, the fifth challenge is to invest in regulatory cooperation. I think in order to achieve regulatory frameworks that move in step to allow this frictionless trade, cooperation in this area will be incredibly essential. Working together would allow both sides to continue maintaining best practice, ensuring new regulations are also appropriate to the UK and the EU's respective economies, and also to maintain a level playing field in terms of the trade and services. And just before I conclude, I also wanted to also highlight that there is a bit more of a focus now from the EU in terms of falling back on a CETA-style framework for the future economic relationship. And I think, you know, I want to be very clear that falling back to existing arrangements like GATS or CETA, for example, do not offer optimal outcomes for services trade. I think what is very clear is that CETA would be a highly deficient model for trade between the UK and the EU. In fact, actually, I think others in the Sussex Trade Policy Observatory have done some excellent work in this area. Analysis by NISA also shows that reverting to an FTA would reduce services trade by 2/3, which is incredibly significant. And so for these reasons, we would argue that that arrangement would be very worrying for businesses indeed. So just to summarize, the 5 challenges that we think that are of most concern to services firms are, well, firstly, removing the risk for cliff edge in trade and services. Second, securing an adequacy decision for data flows. And third, preserving access to talent and labor mobility on both sides of the channel. Fourth, we need a fundamentally new international arrangement for trade and services between the UK and the EU. And finally, investment in regulatory cooperation. I will leave it there, but I look forward to your questions and discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeonjin. And as you already mentioned, we now move to Ingo. Ingo is a senior lecturer in economics at the University of Sussex and is also a fellow of the UK Trade Policy Observatory. And he's going to present here some of the research that the observatory has been done in the role of services and Brexit.
Thank you very much, Raquel, for having me on the panel. Also thanks to Phil. At the UK Trade Policy Observatory, I should say we are a bunch of academics, an interdisciplinary group, mostly economists, but also lawyers and political scientists who set out to provide impartial analyses and commentary on Brexit as it relates to trade policy. I thought challenges for UK services sectors partly arise from exposure, and I'm going to go back to this notion of exposure that we had earlier in the previous panel. It's going to be a bit of good old number crunching, but it's going to be off the back of numbers that we didn't have until very recently, and I'm going to draw on the same kind of numbers that Angelika presented earlier with respect to financial services. The ONS has thankfully, just last year in 2017 released numbers, very detailed numbers on services exports by sector, by region, and sometimes even by destination. And so I'd like to just chart out what we could glean in terms of potential exposure to Brexit for certain regions, with a particular focus to London, from these numbers. And I think exposure really has three dimensions. It's a sheer magnitude of exports, a geographic concentration. It's the orientation, whether it's towards the EU or not, and it's this notion of indirect services exports, which we don't see in the data, and that picks up very much on the very granular and insightful work that Phil McCann has presented before. And I'll round it off by saying something more conceptually, moving from geography to sectors. Why and for which sectors exiting the single market might pose a particular challenge to their competitiveness. So let me get right into it. And let me start from that notion. I think it was stated somewhere on the program that London might be perhaps not as exposed to some other regions to Brexit because it's obviously very specialized in services, financial services, that is mostly consumed domestically. Well, that is true, whilst the average share of gross value added of services in total gross value added across most regions about 80%. For London, it's 96%. So the story really is about services. But if you divide a region's exports, total services exports, over its gross value added as a crude measure of openness, don't take the magnitudes too seriously because, value added is measured in different terms than trade, but, I think the cross-regional estimation does give a message that both London and the Southeast are certainly amongst the most open regions of all the British nations and regions in terms of services exports. Just to put a number on it, between them, London and the Southeast account for over 60% of national services exports, and that's obviously a big number. I should also say, though, that because a lot of the attention also in the media focuses on financial services out of London, apart from these two behemoths and the smaller regions, there is a middle tier of about 4 regions which comprise of Scotland, the east of England, northwest and southwest, who are very substantial services exporters and accounting for about 25% of them. So it's it's a diverse story, and I think every region really deserves its attention. Now, just in terms of size, it's clear that Brexit, in whatever form it's going to materialize, London and the Southeast are going to be heavily affected. This is shifting on towards orientation of services exports. The darker the shade, the higher the share of a region in its service export orientation towards the EU. And you see that, the region, from what you can glean from it, that seem to be most exposed to Brexit on the grounds that it directs most of its services exports to either of the EU 27 member states, are the Northeast and the West Midlands. Now, London here is unduly light grey. This is not true for a bad data reason, because this is balance of payments pink book data, which doesn't include transportation and financial and insurance services. So this is certainly an underestimate for London. The data allow us to go much more deeper, and you can see in this radar chart, which plots the share of the services exports in a particular sector, which is services exports of manufacturing sector firms here towards the EU. You see London all of a sudden again coming out on top, just third again. After the Northeast, the West Midlands, which also come out in the big picture, but also here is London with about 60% of its services exports of firms that belong to the manufacturing sector go to the EU. And this is a regional conference about London, but it pays looking into these data. It turns out that, for instance, the one region with the largest exposure towards the EU in professional, scientific and technical services is North Yorkshire and the Humber, relatively speaking, right? So, if you are a worker in that region, you might be interested, or perhaps even worried. Now, this is what we see from the plain direct services export data for what it's worth. What we don't see is exactly the services exports that are embodied as inputs into British manufacturing exports. And this was what Philip was talking on before, obviously on the basis of much better, much more granular data. Here we have made the first attempt to just put a number of what we call mode 5 services exports, the value of these services inputs into manufacturing exports onto the direct services exports of each region. And it adds about 2.5 to 8 billion per year to every region's and nation's services export. And that's perhaps not small beer. If you add it all up in 2015, that adds another 50 billion to the picture. And this is roughly in the same ballpark as all financial services that we know from the balance of payments. So this should not be disregarded. Now, for the share for London is just relatively small, just by the virtue, because the direct services exports of London is just 100 billion every year. It's just huge, right? But it still is 8 billion, which is a large number. But for the smaller regions, Northeast or the nation of Wales and the East Midlands and the West Midlands, this can account for up to 40% indirect services exports relative to all services exports, direct and indirect. So in a sense, this is embodied into manufacturing services export. So there is a link, and the derived demand for these kind of services obviously then hinges to some extent on unfettered market access in goods, right? So it's important to have this discussion about, is it going to be a customs partnership or a max fac or whatever? It is important because it has knock-on effects that Phil talked about onto services providers that sustain service sector jobs as input providers. I spent my last 1 minute or 2 minutes moving away from the data and reflect just a little bit about why the single market was so beneficial for services, and perhaps in particular some service sectors. Jong Jin thankfully already explained these different modes of service supply, right? And this stuff is called mode 5 trade, which is just there are 4 other modes, right? Which is you provide the service electronically, you have the consumer moving, you have the company moving, or you have the natural person moving. These are the 4 other modes of supply. Many services will use multiple modes, if not all modes, for a successful and competitive delivery of services. And I can give you examples. Ernst & Young, or EY as they now trade, is a big consultancy accounting firm who think, well, naturally their kind of services lend themselves a lot to cross-border trade and movement of their professionals, but actually so happens that EY have offices in every single 28 states of the EU, right? So commercial presence is just an integral part of their way of delivering services. And so this is exactly why the 4 freedoms of the single market have been so beneficial for certain services sectors that rely on simultaneously using multiple modes of supply. And I think from that we can glean conversely, right, that I think it will be these kind of services sectors that are going to be most at risk and potentially most severely affected by exiting the single market as a legal framework. Because we're here in London, I thought the last example I'm going to bring is one of the best examples, is broadcasting. And broadcasting, as Britain is currently in the EU single market, is essentially regulated by a country of origin principle and the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which actually says, you know what, as a broadcaster, you only require a broadcasting license in one country, and then you're good to broadcast your stuff across the entire EU market. And this is why we're here in London. The UK as a country and London as a city has by a wide margin the largest number of broadcasting licenses in the entire EU. with France being a distant second, right? That relies on this country of origin principle. If this falls away, right, then the entire basis for that kind of industry clustering here in London potentially falls away. So, and I'm going to close by making another references to CETA at UK TPO. We've just completed a very detailed study of what CETA, actually the Canadian deal, I should say, the EU-Canada deal would provide for services. And it's got a whole lot of services provisions in there, so it's not true what people have been saying that CETA does not cover services. It does, but it often does not go appreciably beyond the EU's GATS commitment anyway. And unsurprisingly to connoisseurs, audiovisual media is not included. There's a general carve-out on broadcasting and audiovisual media, right? So this tells you something what the UK might be up to once leaving the single market.
Well, thank you very much, Ingo. So now we move into the presentation by Richard Chaplin. He is the founder and chief executive of the Managing Partners Forum. So Managing Partners Forum is a professional body that brings together the professional firms' leaders. And also, he is the mid-market representative of the Governance, Professional and Business Services Council.
The forum has a very strong focus with the mid-market, and it's a regional focus as well. And we bring together leaders, chief executives, and to me, there's no such thing as an organization, only people. And whenever I see the sentence, the firm will, or the organization will, I always say, who will? And all too often, you find that nobody is putting their hand up. So I'm kind of going to look today a little bit about some of the microeconomics. If I'm allowed to use that term, it's probably way out of fashion when I studied it 50 odd years ago at uni. But to me, actually, the way that people react is predictable. Events may be random. And we are at the moment in a context where the events are highly uncertain, if not random. But what I think we can say is the way that people will react, and the leaders of organizations are very key in that context. So we did a survey, which I'll take you through in a minute. And I just thought it would be helpful to give you a little bit of information about what it is that the leaders of professional firms are thinking in connection with Brexit. So we did it in January, so it's reasonably up to date. 35 responses, about 90% CEO level, very senior level people, 60% in London, 40% elsewhere, so I can't give a specific London take on that, but London obviously slightly more than the majority. Mix was 43 law, you can read the rest. Needless to say, a large Brexit glossary was provided, because otherwise you weren't going to get a level playing field, because most people, it's just a wave of acronyms, so we tried to make sure that at least the leaders, and it took them 20 minutes to complete probably, and this was presented as was evidence to the House of Lords. So that's a little bit about the survey. And I'm just going to pick out 4 or 5 interesting elements from that survey. The first one we asked was, I wouldn't try and define soft Brexit, but what does it mean to you? Well, it probably won't come as any great surprise if I say that at this point in time, the professions have never been busier. We do trend analysis. We do it pretty much every year, perhaps a bit less sometimes. And in the 7 or 8 years we've been collecting it, the professional services firms have never been busier in terms of our levels of activity are above normal, our headcount is above normal, our new work inflow is above normal. And it's actually quite logical, because going back to something that was said today, if you are faced with uncertainty, the best way to react to uncertainty is to analyze all the options that are available to you, but then do nothing. Because in doing nothing, you are keeping an option on each of the options. But who are you going to hire to do the analysis? Professional services. Hence, short-term boost, modest decline. Hard Brexit, short-term boost, no question. Significant decline in 2 particular places. One, the revenues from the EU27 are expected to decline by more than new revenues from other places. And secondly, clients will increasingly be serviced by taking the EY example, other offices within the network. So that will lead to significant decline in financial performance. Picking up another key issue, talent, nice number, 54%. I think you said more than half, so we're pretty close on that one. Consider it to be either essential or important for their firms. And another number, 48% often send their people around Europe. These are, again, quite big numbers. Trading arrangements, 74% said that the EU Services Directory was essential or important to facilitate the supply of services to EU clients. That's a very, very high number. And when we looked into some of the modes, we found from WTO that particularly mode 3 and 4, which is around foreign commercial presence and movement to natural persons, very, very strong agreement that this would be, just wouldn't allow them to do it, which again absolutely echoes what I've just heard. So what else did we pick up? Well, we looked at legal structures. Nearly 40% think that they're going to have to probably restructure themselves. LLPs actually don't exist in many European countries, and that's the standard form that many professional firms adopt. And of that 39%, they're going to have to do it quite quickly, I think. And that takes us into what they want government to do. We haven't really talked about government and what the government want. What do these guys leading these professional firms want government to do? Well, I just came up with the top 3. I don't think anybody's going to be too surprised if freedom of movement comes up the top, based on everything we've heard today. Politically, maybe not viable, but certainly withdrawing Article 50 was quite high on the list. You know, well, it's a reality for some people. And the one that actually possibly you mounted me to think about is let's make the UK a more attractive place. There's a lot of evidence that people don't just come because of the economics. They come because it's a nice place to be. There's lots of stories about bankers who are being told by their wives that there's no way they're going to move to Frankfurt because London's just amazing. So let's make sure, whatever else happens, that we make the UK a more attractive place. Now, whether that's economics, I don't know, but that to me is something that we can all think about. So what are they doing about it? Well, this is back in January, so we're 3-4 months on now, perhaps a bit more. So at that stage, near 80% were thinking about what they were going to do. 20% of them are already starting to implement those plans. And more importantly, we said, what about your clients? What are they doing? And again, 40% there. Now, the only thing I can be reasonably sure about is that those numbers are going to be a lot higher by May. A lot higher. That was back in January. So that's all in a document. I've got a few copies here. It's all on the website if you are interested to read that data. What I also wanted to do is to kind of pick up a big issue that we talked about today, a little bit earlier, around productivity. Because it seemed to me that productivity and prosperity were things that are essential. I think, was it Paul Krugman who said, productivity is almost everything? I think that was his quote. And something that I think probably people here may not be aware of, which is the extent to which productivity is linked to employee engagement. Now, there's quite a lot of academic research which says it's a strong two-way causal relationship between employee engagement and productivity. And everybody knows the UK has a productivity problem. We talked about that a lot. What people probably aren't aware of is that the level of employee engagement in professional firms is typically 2 to 3 times higher than at their clients. Now, there's a number of reasons why that might be the case. I think personally it's to do with the fact that command and control does not operate as a management style. A, you won't get re-elected, and B, they'll ignore you anyway. Whereas challenge and support, which is the one that is probably the default in our world, in other words, I'm going to give you a really tough challenge, but you know you have my support to get you there, is normal. In fact, it's the only way to manage a professional service firm, quite frankly. Now, if you actually look at a quite interesting new book called Mind of a Leader, which came out a few weeks ago from Harvard, who are one of our knowledge partners, it was basically saying, if you want to be an effective leader, you have to have 3 things. You have to be mindful, mindfulness, you have to be compassionate, and you have to be selfless. Don't think very many captains of industry would tick those boxes. That's the norm in the professions. And that's the style that they're saying, take mindful, take the mind of the leader. So really what we're saying is, hang on, there is a hidden asset. No business can be successful without a mix of great products and great management, great leadership. It's just not possible. So how come the professions are only selling the product bit? What about this strange group of people called the management who are running these massively billion-dollar businesses? Does PwC have management, people say? Who knows? They do. So our argument is that actually we should be looking for ways of encouraging the leaders of professional firms to engage with the leaders of their clients, and most of the insecure overachievers on the front line won't let them, and that's not my term, by the way, because they're a bit worried about management might say something nasty to their management, to the other management. So let's look for ways to bring the two together. And of course, the hook for us is access to government, because mostly in the mid-market, nobody talks to government anymore. And government doesn't involve the mid-market in pre-policy either. So the technology is the easy bit. Let's bring them together. And what are these management people going to talk about? They're going to talk about how the front line are letting them down? I don't think so. They'll talk about management issues. They'll talk about resilience. They'll talk about employee engagement. They'll talk about how do you cope when people ignore your emails? Command and control doesn't cope with that. Completely normal in the professions. And in the process, maybe we'll do something to help resolve the UK's productivity problem.
Thank you very much. So now, last but not least, Anthony Rain is coming from Deloitte, and he is a manager within the Deloitte's Brexit Insights and International Trade Policy team. He is also liaised with the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy and the Department for International Trade to represent the views of Deloitte and the wider professional business services. So please, Anthony. I think it's a challenge because after this panel, probably everything has been said. So please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Raquel. Yes, I'll try not to. I'm conscious of time, but I'll try to build on what Jing and Richard have just said. But I think I'm not an economist, so I think it's been outlined today the difficulties and challenges that are ahead. So I'm not going to touch and go into too much more detail on that. But in terms of competitiveness with Brexit and with professional services, so as Raquel said, I work for Deloitte within the Brexit team, and I also work within the Professional Business Services Council. This council is co-chaired by a government minister and the Deloitte chairman, and it represents the big four magic circle law firms, engineering firms, and which Richard is also a part of. So, and part of that remit is to inform and challenge the government on what is going on with what they are doing with the industrial strategy and also with Brexit. But I think it's important to note, so with professional services firms, we really are sort of symbiotic with the health of the economy. We have 11% of GVA and 61% of jobs are situated outside the southeast. We are bigger than financial services in terms of exports. In 2016, we had 66 billion of exports. So it's important to note that whilst we have these representative figures, if our clients are not doing well, then we don't do well, and that's why it is that symbiotic relationship with the health of the economy. So we recruit graduates, we recruit apprenticeships, and which is why it's so important looking ahead to identify that certainly from a professional services point of view, where we sit within the importance for the country and for the growth of the economy. There's also the soft power aspect of the rule of or the English law, the courts, which underpin a lot of the governance that around the world, and this helps and sort of embody the trust that a lot of firms see when they look to professional services firms for help and support. And in terms of Brexit, so looking ahead, I think it's already been talked about quite a lot, but people is absolutely fundamental to this, and access to talent is obviously something that is at risk looking ahead. And so I won't go too much into that, but it's looking at, I think, sort of the kind of system that we have in a post-Brexit world in order to keep being competitive, to keep the UK attractive, as the survey's already sort of indicated, is absolutely fundamental, and that means continuing to attract students to come to the country, having the right mechanism to allow that to happen, but also allowing that sort of continuation for them to continue post-study in the UK as well. And this is absolutely important for us to continue to be competitive and to ensure that we have access to that best talent here. We've already talked upon about sort of the about mutual recognition of professional qualifications, but this is absolutely essential to us. So whether you're an accountant and you're going to audit audit a client abroad, you're an engineer that needs to sort of go across and to somewhere in Europe, and you need to repair an aircraft, for example, and suddenly you may be bound by those laws that are or regulations within EASA, for example. And then as a lawyer flying in and flying out, that's absolutely important as well. And to have this capability in order to continue the growth of the professional services sector, in order to be competitive, we need to have these mechanisms that continue. So I think looking ahead now in terms of, I think we've articulated what a lot of these problems are. What are sort of firms doing about it? And I think I certainly agree that it's understanding the scenarios and understanding the analysis that's been done already, certainly for firms, and understanding where that exposure is. Because as soon as you understand that, you have a better grip of where that exposure lies. You're in a better position to actually start thinking about what your options could be. And most importantly, understanding what the timelines are from when you may have to pull that trigger. So I think we see Brexit as a risk like any other, something that can be planned, can be analysed, planned for, and mitigated against if you do that planning and consideration early enough, and that's absolutely fundamental. The other sort of aspects I think about what can be doing about it and keeping competitive, looking ahead. I think it's already been talked upon by Andrew Carter today. I think his points are really interesting about there are a lot of issues that are already going on besides Brexit, and I think both a lot of people sort of think about government as being the forum that needs to sort of make all that change. I think business has a great responsibility as well, that it needs to work and collaborate with government to tackle these changes and the great disparities that there are still here in this country, whether or not we have Brexit or not. And it's looking about how we develop our talent and how we increase greater social mobility up and down the country. We talked about today that that the regions obviously voted for Brexit, and London was very much Remain, but 40% of people in London still voted Remain, and in my eyes that's still a big figure. And we need to be asking the questions about why is that so? So looking ahead, I think we need to be thinking about what are the skills we need for the future. Looking at the capabilities that we need to build. So that's understanding what the impact of technology is going to have. How do we look at sort of secondary education? How do we look at tertiary education? And how does that impact? Because that will ultimately impact business models going ahead. And looking forward to the future. There's also lifelong learning we need to think about. And in terms of social mobility, I know I've already mentioned sort of the apprenticeships, but it's understanding where in the apprenticeship levy, for example, we can use that to help increase social mobility up and down the country. So I think sort of looking, just sort of finish rounding up now, I think the key things that I see looking ahead is understanding and employing the mechanisms to secure the right environments in the future. So whether that be laying better foundations for developing the talent and also social mobility, but it's also looking at the now and understanding what those mechanisms need to be, whether that's in a free trade agreement and the right sort of and the right immigration system that we might employ here. Those will be absolutely fundamental, I think, to the competitiveness not just of the sector but the economy looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. So now we have like 5 minutes for questions. So please, any question in the room?
Yes, one thing that you didn't mention in terms of making this country more attractive for people who possibly thinking, where am I going to go, is English. I think the EU is losing a very important part of communication, and that also comes with what the other speaker was saying about communication. Communication in English is virtually every country's goal, to be able to speak English. And we communicate, as do America, as that is our first language. And I do think that one thing we have in our favour is that language. How we exploit it, which we have to, and allow more immigration on that basis to come here to learn, to spread good things about the world rather than bad, I think through social media is very vital. I think the English language probably is the basis of social media. I don't know how you think that loss of English in the EU I'd have thought obviously in competition with the French, but it is an important addition to the EU. And how do we end up thinking we need a soft Brexit in communication with EU leaders in terms of that, for a start? I don't think anybody seems to have mentioned that as a very important factor in our favour. Does anybody want to respond?
Richard, maybe.
I mean, everything I've understood and read is that there is strong pressure within certainly the EU institutions, not just to retain English, but to make it more used than it currently is.
The panel member who spoke about the higher education sector, unfortunately left, so we kind of imperfectly take his place. There are a lot of foreign students, especially perhaps Indian and Chinese students at UK higher institute. That's going to be on the table if the UK ventures out into this brave new world of free trade agreements, right? The Indians are not so keen on possibly doing trade deals narrowly conceived on manufacturing or perhaps not even on services. One of the things they're really interested in is increased quotas for student visas. And I'm not sure how that sits with the narrative of leaving the EU and as it relates to immigration and all of that. In a sense, I perfectly agree with you, right? We should have that and we should bolster that.
Any more questions, Dora? Here.
Thank you. I just want to add something, if I may. This is, somebody was talking, well, you were talking about broadcasting earlier. And broadcasting is actually consumerism. So as long as I think that you keep into that sector, at least at that level, then you will continue gaining. But just so you know, I'm from The Hague. And I see it more and more in Europe. English is still there. Don't have to worry about that. And I think the fact that we still have trade, then we still have lifestyle, because consumerism, lifestyle, they connect. And all that language is one of the main things that you pointed out, because that's what creates markets.
Thank you very much, Dora.
I've been following a lot of the DTI and the Credit Expo stuff and what the government's trying to do about the trade globally. And it seems incredibly focused on goods trade and a real lack of momentum or information around the services sector. And I'm wondering, whether it's just behind closed doors for private organisations to manifest their own direction globally with services, or whether there is actually some work going on with the government that, again, is behind closed doors, that's not reaching the public attention around how the services sector is being supported as we exit the European Union.
I think it's probably going on behind closed doors. I can certainly say that from a professional services point of view, the point has definitely been made collectively. And that's kind of one of the points of the council that we have, is to make sure that those views and presenting clear facts and case studies which iron out what are the potential impacts of them not being in a free trade agreement, for example, what the implications of that might be. So whilst it might not be grabbing the front page of the newspapers, I can assure you that behind closed doors, those conversations have definitely been had. Certainly that's from my view anyway.
And I think just to add to that as well, I would agree with Anthony's assessment. I know, for a fact that the city, for example, has already led delegations to the US, to Japan, to China to talk about, what potential partnership could be created for financial services as well. So I think for sure those discussions are happening. I think the challenge that the sector and indeed the government might have is that it's quite difficult to be able to agree on very concrete measures at this point without knowing what the future economic relationship is going to be like with the EU. But for sure, those discussions are happening.
Just very quickly, there are sectors such as financial services and perhaps a number of creative industry sectors where the UK is obviously very, very strong and has sort of a competitive advantage to it. It is impossible for reasons of the global multilateral system to really just strike sectoral deals. What you can't have is just a deal with the EU encompassing financial services and automotive, because that would fly in the face of WTO rules. So it needs to be a broad deal, and there can be degrees of nuances, right? It can be deeper in financial services and perhaps not so deep in other ones, but it has to be comprehensive in order to pass that test. And so that's a big worry. At the moment, and I agree with you, for my liking, there's too much attention on the customs partnership versus MaxFAC relative to what we perhaps should be talking about is services. And having a deal going forward that takes care of that 80 to 90% of our domestic economic activity, which is services. So I agree.
Just to remake a point, because I made it very fast, I think, during my presentation, about non-tariff barriers and general scenarios being used for the macroeconomic impact scenarios. And those macro impact studies have very low tariffs on the services sector. And that's because we have very little information on how much the costs really are for the services sector, which all the people here on the table have talked a lot about. And that gives you the impression that maybe these numbers are a little bit small, which are being used in the scenarios at the moment, but we don't have the data to really test this because we didn't have this level of integration before in the past that we can compare the effect. At least that's my intuition, is that these numbers are a bit small in the scenarios.
I think there's also an issue around, let's use the word lobbying. Professions, I always take the view, have kind of 3 or 4 things that really matter to them. One is their clients, second is their people, third is they want to pay their taxes and be good citizens, and fourth, please leave us alone. They just don't like putting their head above the parapet. It's just not their style. We're the guys who quietly work with clients and sort out the problems. So when it comes to deploying the technical expertise of the professions to help government, which Anthony and others are involved in, it's phenomenal. The amount of expertise that has been marshalled across lots and lots of different major professional firms to sit down with civil servants and help take them through the issues and help them understand. Sandpit is a term that might be used in tech. It's very similar. That goes on. Now, that clearly remains within a very small space of space. But in terms of the sector as a whole, we just don't really like, it's a point that Philip made earlier, we just don't really feel comfortable putting our head around and saying this matters to us. It's just not used to it. We just quietly get on in the background. And I think that's the issue that a lot of what today has been to me is, hang on, going back to Philip's numbers, this section is very adversely affected. Are you going to do anything about it? And that's the wake-up call, which I think this research has been so brilliant in stimulating, so thank you.
Well, I think that just join me to thank you to all these panelists. I think it has been...